This is part one of a two-part podcast.
Hi, my name's Ryan. I've been a supporter of Paul's for many years now. I wish to get the podcast and video creation part of the system we call Paul back up to full speed. And I think Patreon support is a big part of that system. Go over to patreon.com/Paul Wheaton, make a pledge for each artifact that Paul creates. Again, the site is patreon.com/Paul Wheaton. You can also find the link in the podcast notes. Enjoy the podcast.
All right. Somewhere there's like a red dot or something showing that we're recording.
I see it.
Oh, there. I see it. Okay. It took me a while to find it. Today we're going to talk about how to select land. So, or something like that. Quest for land. So basically, I'm on the phone here with Kyle and Mark, and they have both listened to either all of my podcasts or damn near, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. All right. And I think we were recording a podcast as part of the Sepulcher stuff or the Permaculture Smackdown stuff. Mm-hmm. Kyle came up with this idea. Let's travel in this path because apparently I haven't covered this in a podcast. And so while we were preparing for it, it turned out that there's other stuff that I haven't covered in a previous podcast either, which I think is super important stuff along these lines, because the mission is like, all right, you're going to make the leap onto land. And as Kyle put it a moment ago, like, I want to know all this stuff so I don't get there and then end up having to move. Because, of course, permaculture is a rather perennial thing. Now, I did write a 3-part series. I don't know what this must have been, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that. And I shared it with everybody on the Dailyish. Like, hey, everybody on the Dailyish, look at what I wrote, and there it is. And so, I don't know if people have ever looked at it ever since. But when Kyle asked this, I pointed it out. And so, Kyle, this is the first you've seen of it, is when I pointed it out like a couple weeks ago or so?
Yes.
Okay.
And yeah, it was a 3-part series on exactly what we're talking about now.
Yeah. Okay, cool. To start all this off, there's this very important thing. All people who live in the country are divided into 3 groups. And I gotta say that this is a great big steaming pile of my opinion, and which is kind of what's being asked for. So, forgive my arrogance as I leap into this. These 3 groups of people are about the same size. Group 1, people are happy. They're at least authentically happy or feigning happiness to me. And that means that they get along awesome with all of their neighbors. And they're not getting any trouble from their regional government stuff. And so they're doing everything that they want to do, and it's not like they've got people saying you can't do that. So I believe that within this group of happy people, I'm going to believe maybe a quarter of them or a third of them are authentically through and through happy. And I've been to places where, wow, what a tight-knit, beautiful, and wonderful community. It can exist. It is out there. So it is possible. Second group, same size as the first, same size as the third. Second group, unhappy. Psychotic neighbor. Mike Ayler I've heard probably 1,000 different hostile, horrible stories, but just as an example, Mike Ayler did not get along with his neighbor. His neighbor owned land uphill of him. They feuded so much that the neighbor went to the local town, Bonner's Ferry, and apparently bought one of those RV waste sites where you empty your blue RV liquid of all the poop and urine and all that stuff, and bought one of those, and then proceeded to take what he extracted from that and dumped it on the fence line between his property and Mike's property.
Oh, wow.
And did that for so many years that the water for the whole neighborhood became undrinkable.
Wow.
So now everybody in the neighborhood now has to go and import drinking water. Did I say 1,000 stories? That's just 1,000 stories that people have told me one-on-one. And in this respect, it sort of sucks to be me because these are really depressing stories. And sometimes it's a neighbor who intentionally is very loud just to piss you off, and in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes it has to do with the neighbor's dog eating your animals, killing your animals and eating them, and the neighbor saying, no, they didn't. They've been locked up over here all day, and it's like, well, I got pictures, and it's like your pictures are fake. Those kinds of neighbor. Then, of course, we're all familiar with the Department of Making You Sad, and I gotta. Whenever I say that, I should be saying, you know what, there's a lot of people that work as regulators that I've met that have been terrific. And I've heard a lot of stories from people trying to work with regulators, and the regulators are bending over backwards to try and help them out. And at the same time, we do know of the stories that are not that way. And I've been, and a lot of the stories I hear, like I go to present somewhere, and then people are like, can I talk to you after the class? And okay, and I hear the stories, and it's like they try to do a thing and then like grow a garden. No, that's not allowed in this county. You got to be kidding me. Just growing a garden? And it turns out some places it's not allowed. So and it's kind of like
covenants and restrictions can vary a lot based on where you're at.
The stories are painful and massive, and they go, and so it's like it goes on and on and on. Group 1, happy. Group 2, unhappy. Group 3 universally used to belong to Group 2, and they moved. And they selected a place where these kinds of problems are minimized, or more specifically, the problems that they were experiencing are minimized. Typically, they seek property that's at the end of a road, or a property where everything on their property is not visible by their neighbors or by others. And on top of that, these people tend to choose to not develop relationships within 10, sometimes 20 miles of their home. So that way, they'll be left alone and they can have peace. I mean, isn't that what a lot of us are seeking? Now, granted, we all want Group 1. That's what we want. We want to have magnificent neighbors and no problems from the government, and we want everything to be silky smooth all the time. We want it to be just amazing. When I moved on to Mount Spokane, I contacted all of my neighbors and invited them over to my place for a big potluck. It ignited old feuds that I never knew existed until, I just arrived. I didn't know about these old feuds. And I got to learn I met some good people, but for every good person, there was probably 3 that was kind of like fucking nuts. And so, And then everyone had a story. There was a gal in the neighborhood who seemed to have bad things to say about everybody. And it turns out she had a bit of and she worked as a professional in town. And so you're thinking like, oh, she's an upstanding citizen and everything. And it turns out she's just poisoned through and through. But not only that, she has a bit of a problem with the pharmaceuticals. Her problem with the pharmaceuticals is so powerful that she sneaks into everybody's house on the road to steal their pharmaceuticals.
Wow.
And she gets caught. And she's just, tries to brush it off as if it's nothing. So then there's a guy who has horses, but they're standing around in their own shit, and he has not called a farrier, so they've got like those hooves that kind of curve up. I don't know if you've ever seen this.
Oh, it's horrible. There's channels, farriers have YouTube channels that you can watch, and some of these are really, really rough. They're just ignored for way too long.
And that's the guy that calls the Department of Making You Sad 3 times a week for all the neighbors, turning them in for whatever he can think of. And so,
how's that saying go? Defense is a good offense.
Or
keep
I don't know.
Correct. They don't see what you're doing.
Somehow you got to work in boredom on this. I mean, what the hell is wrong with this guy? How bored do you have to be? So,
I gotta take that out. I don't want to look at that.
The thing is nobody was calling the Department of Making You Sad on this guy because they had their own lives to live and they're trying to do their own things. But suddenly here comes all this other stuff, So all I'm saying is that there's 3 groups, and so I thought it was so I think it's important. I think there's a lot of people. We've got to have respect for this because in a lot of ways I'm trying to do that where I am now. Part 3, group 3, live at the end of a road and just keep to myself and not develop a lot of relationships within 10 or 20 miles. And it's like instead, I love Missoula, Montana. I love Missoula. I love to develop relationships in Missoula. And so Missoula is a wonderful community. But even more than that, there's a whole lot of people that are here now. I think there's 15 of us that are here on my property right now. So we have our own little community. We have lots of community right here, right now. So, I kind of feel like, our community needs are being met, as is. Now, granted, when I was down in Mount Spokane and I got to know some people, developing those relationships makes it so it's so much easier to live in the country when you develop those relationships with the good people. Because the good people are like when I had these 2 old tractors and, some people wanted to borrow the tractors and they were really good mechanics. And so they would get these tractors working and then use them and return them in better shape than they borrowed them. And it's like, there were a lot of great relationships, but it's like in the end, the downsides were like 4 times more than the upsides. So that's an element when to think about when looking for land. I don't know. Whenever I mention this stuff and people have not bought their land yet, then they are certain that they're going to be in the first group. They're going to pick a place where everybody is wonderful. All their neighbors are fantastic. Everything is great. And of course, we're going to get into this in a little bit. But there's also something to be said for, well, if you're going to go into this area and you're going to go get some acres, what's the price per acre in this neighborhood where everybody is wonderful and the government is decent? Do you guys want to make an estimate? Go ahead.
Well, depending on the size that you're looking at, right? The cost per acre tends to go up the fewer acres you're dealing with. But if you're talking about agricultural land and, versus sloped land, and I think it also depends too on what your goals are. When you talk about people being group one, right? And being happy, well, how are you going to be happy? And like with neighbors, it's I think pretty rare, unless your neighbors each have 1,000 acres and you only have 3 or 4 neighbors, that you're always going to run into the crazy one, right? Or just somebody who is going to be diametrically opposed. Is that the right word? Diametrically, that sort of the complete opposite of you, personality-wise. That it doesn't matter what you're doing, the two of you just aren't going to get along. And so you get enough people around you, you're eventually going to run into that individual. And unfortunately, if that individual doesn't have anything better to do, then that could be their form of entertainment. You talk about like, how's this guy, calling up the department and making you sad on all of his neighbors all the time. It's like, well, that could be a person's form of entertainment. Instead of watching TV, they just like to harass other people in whatever form it is. In this case, calling the codes department. I'm
going to say that if you go to if you're Group A and it's authentic, everything is dreamy and smooth. The people in the area are just terrific. What a lovely group, and it's paradise. I think you're looking at $10,000 to $20,000 per acre for like 10 to 80 acres, something like that. I think that when you get to some place where the neighbors are generally more problematic, the price per acre is going to go down a lot because the people are trying to get out of there. They're like, I'm trying to move. And there's a lot of different people that are trying to leave that area. And
you still there, Paul?
I'm still here.
I hear you, Mike.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to say that here in Montana, it's like, yeah, you can get land that's $1,000 an acre, and we'll talk about that. But I think one of the things that brings the price way down is going to be that it's more likely to be Group 2, and so if you wanna try and get that to work, you probably should be looking at Group 3 strategies. And then, if you've got the money for it, then by all means, take a look at Group 1. Now, at the same time, I have seen land where it's like, okay, here's a plot of land, and it's 20 acres, and it comes with a 3-bedroom house, and and I would estimate that it's worth $250,000, but the guy's trying to sell it for $750,000, and it's been on the market for 7 years. It's kind of like, and I think his policy is that he really doesn't want to sell the land, but if somebody came along and offered him $750,000, he'd take it. And at the same time, this is an important one. I remember when I lived on Mount Spokane, there was a property at the base of the road, and I think it was like 60 acres, and it had a homestead and a bunch of outbuildings and stuff like that. And a lot of times when you're going to go and buy rural land, you cannot get a bank to carry it. You cannot get a mortgage. And so owner financing is pretty common. And the normal thing that you do is it's going to be 1/3 down, and then a normal interest rate as if it was a bank, so something on the order of like 5%. And so this guy sold the property, and the people paid 1/3 down, and they made their mortgage payments, for a while. And then something happened, like living out in the country, that turns out they couldn't pull it off. And so he foreclosed. He got it back. And apparently he sold this same property that way 6 times.
Wow.
Wow.
What a, and apparently, I mean, the lesson here is like, if you're going to go buying property, you better be careful of this kind of thing. And on top of that, maybe don't do a mortgage, because if you're going to do a mortgage, part of it is the whole concept of like, now you got to go get a worky job and keep working that worky job to pay the mortgage. And so, that could be a dangerous thing, especially if you're in group 1 and the cost of that property was like $3 million.
Right.
It's like, oh shit. Okay.
Yeah, one of your goals is to make money on the property, and particularly if you're not already making money that way.
True. Then,
well, I'm going to, raise sheep or cattle and make my money to pay the bills that way. And it's like, yeah, that can be a tough way to learn, the hard way usually, that it's, like you said, either purchase it up front or have some other way to make money. But on NPR yesterday, they had the agriculture secretary on, and he mentioned it. I think the number was, it was either 86.9 or 89.6% of all farmers do not make most of their money by farming, that they have another job or some other source of income that actually paid the bills, that it's a little over 10% of farmers can actually make their living as farmers and not need to do something else. So when somebody goes to buy a property and their plan is, well, I'm going to pay all my bills by what I grow on that land or raise on that land, that can be very difficult.
I agree. And I think there was a fascinating story, which I hope I put into a podcast years and years ago, about a couple that were all about everything organic. And they moved to an area where the big regional crop was cherries. And so they bought a cherry orchard, and they arrived saying, we are going to do strictly organic because these are our values, these are our standards. And then they found themselves like 6 years later, and he couldn't do it. The wife kind of was partially involved, but it was mostly the guy, mostly the husband. He was like, he tried and tried and tried. So basically it's like they did something similar. In order to be able to get by, they're kind of like they went conventional. And so they're spraying and stuff. And the thing is that a lot of money passed through their fingers, but at the end of the year, they went into the red every year. And so it's like, you get all your cherries, and then you get to the warehouse, and that's when you find out how much money you're going to get paid for all your cherries. And then they take your cherries, and then they save them, and they do this and they do that and whatever. And then, so they paid you money for the cherries, and then they took money out of that for doing all the things that they do to sell your cherries. And for half the people, they ended up like that transaction alone was in the negative. Like the amount being paid for the cherries was small, and then the amount being paid for them to do all the things that they have to do to sell the cherries was high and was bigger than the amount that they'd get paid for the cherries. So it was like they owed money. They delivered cherries, and because they delivered cherries, they now owed money to that organization. And so my impression was is that the wife had a job which is basically paying for the husband to make a go out of conventional cherry orcharding. And so it's like, and that's a very common story. I hear that a lot. Like with wheat, you drop off your wheat and you get paid this small amount, and they store your wheat. And then the first wheat they sell is for their friends or for themselves. Your wheat just sits in the silos, and then you pay rent on that silo until your wheat is sold.
Wow.
And so it's like some people are making money and some people are not. And I think this is a great time to mention, I love what Joel Salatin says about those people have an unfair advantage. And what you really need to do is create your own unfair advantage. All right. Yes. I think that, and I kind of feel like it comes back to Mortgage Free, where Mortgage Free, the thing is you gotta buy the land outright. No mortgage. You know? You gotta, if you don't have enough to buy the land outright, you keep living humbly until you have it. And then you buy the land outright. Not, don't do the mortgage thing. None of that. So, all right.
Okay.
Kyle, you now have the steering wheel. This was your idea to have this podcast, and I can't remember what I have and have not talked about in past podcasts. So okay. You have the steering wheel. What are we talking about now?
So I've got some notes from your articles, and I just kind of made an outline of them. I think we just start at the beginning and go through that, and then we could go to my specific situation after that.
Okay. So the first thing is how many acres?
The first thing you talk about is how many acres, and you start your calculation with having a herd of cows.
Right. So
and then with the small herd of cows, I think it was 5. You calculated that you'll need 80 acres.
True. That is true. So then I think it's fair to say, do you like beef? Do you like dairy? Things of that nature. Is that going to be part of your diet? Is that going to be part of what you're doing? Is cattle? And so I also feel like it's 80 acres in the kind of climate where I want to live. So a colder climate. I mean, I think that's another. I'm sure in past podcasts I've talked about when I go to select land, I want forested slope. I do not want flat. And I want a colder climate so I can build the soil. So, all right. So if I'm going to be in this colder climate with slope, and I'm going to want to at least have the option to have cattle someday, then the bare minimum is 80 acres. Now, you're reading that. Both of you have, I'm guessing, read this and understood it. This is a great time to contest my math.
Well, your 80 acres is including that you're going to be growing hay that you'll bale and store for winter feeding. And maybe you're slaughtering one of those cows each year and, butchering it for your meat needs for the year. And if you're going to get 200 or 300 pounds of meat of various cuts from one of those animals.
I'm saying that if you like raising one cow is inappropriate, and so and the minimum grouping is 5. And so if you're going to travel this path, and then this is without importing hay, I mean, that can be very problematic. If you're going to buy your hay, then, that opens the door for a lot of problems. So then you want to be self-sustaining, then you're going to do that part yourself. And then, that opens up a lot of different doors on how you go about it. Are you going to bale it or not? And things of that nature.
Right. But not have to get hardware, machinery to do that. Unless somebody's going to be out there with super strong arms and a scythe,
Well, and that is a way that's done. I lean more in the general direction of going hayless, and so in which case, if you're transitioning towards hayless, maybe you're going to have still some hay, enough hay for just a few months out of the winter instead of 6. Paths like that. But the thing is that it's like, okay, if you're going to do beef and or dairy, or you want to at least have that option, then it's 80 acres. Now, Kyle,
yes,
my memory is that you're not a beef eating kind of guy.
I'm not. No.
So,
I guess we're getting at that I am a vegan. And you've talked before about, and I understand the concept that vegans would do well to have ruminants rotationally grazing on their land. And I'm inclined to agree with that, but do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Well, I would think that what would be a great fit for a vegan is to, I kind of feel like, all right, I've got like 170 things rolling around in my head at once.
Uh-huh.
I think community. I want there to be 200 acres, and I want there to be, like at least 8 families on that plot. And maybe 1 or 2 of those families will be vegan. And then one of the families will keep some cattle, and they'll move the cattle around the whole plot, the whole property. And then I think that the vegans would benefit from that, even if they're not going to partake in that, in the beef or the dairy. There's also vegetarians, and there's all kinds of different dietary choices. And I think another thing to keep in mind is that people's dietary choices tend to change throughout their lives, for reasons. All that said, I kind of feel like that's where I'm going. Is I would choose to move towards community. I think that's the smart play. Like even if we're going to talk about Gertitude, I believe that Gert is like, she's got her 2.5 acres in the middle of a shared property thing. That's what I think. But, for a lot of people that are listening to this, they're thinking to themselves like, no, I'm looking for property that's just for me and mine and not a bunch of other people. And it's like, okay, I think that's what this podcast is for, right? Not like for people that are looking for their land, but not community, for their own thing. Am I right on that?
No. I would like, our kind of general plan is to have our land and then our community that follows that, kind of, in a way, mirroring what you have going on, whereas I have, what you have going on is you have these, your ethics and your goals, and you know that it will take community. So you went ahead and bought the land, and you're attracting people that want to live your style of community instead of trying to go out and find your specific style of community.
Right.
So ours is pretty similar to yours. Our ethics and goals and needs and wants but not exactly aligned with yours. So we're trying to find, if we can, a larger plot and invite people that share our specific ethics and needs and wants and aesthetic and all those things to come live on it afterwards. But yeah.
So exactly the same, but 2 steps to the left.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. All right.
2 states to the left.
Oh, okay. There's that too. So slightly different.
Would you say that you were talking about raising ruminants on that land, even though you're vegan, would it be an option of where, say, you find someone else who wants to have those cattle, but they could keep them on your property? Like I knew a couple that, I forget if they had, I think it was maybe just 10 acres, but it's possible it was 20. But about half of that, they would essentially raise cattle for a third party, and they would show up and have their 20 or 30 calves, and they had electric fence around, I think it was about a half acre sections. And every day the cattle would have access to one of those sections, and maybe 2 days. And then they would get moved to the next section, which had grass that was a foot tall. And so the cows would go crazy on that and start to eat it down. And then they'd go through at least a dozen of these before they got back to the original one. So there'd be like 2 weeks worth of growth. And they would do that from spring to fall. And then the owner of those cattle would show up with their truck, pick them all up. And as payment, this couple was given one of those cows that would get butchered for them. And then they would, here's your 300 pounds of meat. And overall, the amount of time spent wasn't that high, essentially just moving the cows from one section to the next every day or two. And that worked as far as, and they were paid with meat. In your case, you'd be paid in cash or something along those lines. Would that be one of the options you'd consider? Because otherwise, if you're not
I don't think
raising
so.
cattle, the land.
I don't think that's within our ethics.
Okay.
Okay.
But would you have other people in the community you're looking at that would be doing that? Or is the goal that everybody that you would be bringing to that property would also be vegan, or that you just wouldn't be raising animals for slaughter?
I don't know yet. In an optimum world, in an optimum world, everybody's vegan. But yeah, in our little community, I don't think we would force anyone to be to adhere to our dietary restrictions. But at the same time, I don't think allowing the use of our land for things that are against our ethics would be acceptable.
Right.
Okay. I'm gonna move on to a slightly different angle of how many acres.
Okay.
And I'm gonna say, I believe that a small adult who works full time at growing their own food without importing anything can take a quarter of an acre and in time, like after 10 years, get that quarter of an acre to the point that it'll produce enough food to feed that person, that one person. Enormous amount of work. That ongoing every year. At the same time, if you set up a single acre using permaculture techniques, I think with very little effort, it'll provide enough food for one person. And I keep thinking that 1 acre is about right for the amount of food to feed one person in general using permaculture.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't give you any room for other things. Like, do you need wood for not only heat, but also possibly for building certain things? Or, wood's a very valuable material for all kinds of stuff. And then the other thing is that I think that if you had 2 acres per person, it would probably be even easier still, and it would not be as cramped. So now if you're going to talk about having a family, the question is well, how big of a family? Now, so like let's say that you've got 4 people, and then you've got possibly, rather than 2 acres per person, which would be 8 acres, it's more like 7 or 6 acres. That should be quite comfortable for a family. 6 or 7 acres would be quite comfortable to grow all the food without imports, which I think is important to keep in mind, because of course there are people that have grown enough food to feed 2 or 3 people on a quarter of an acre, but they had a lot of imports. They brought in a lot of fertilizers, a lot of manures, a lot of this and that and the other thing. So, without imports. So I kind of feel like an acre, yes, that's comfortable. More than an acre, a little more comfortable still. So, next thing. What are your neighbors like? And I kind of feel like I've heard this story a lot, where 100% of your next door neighbors are sprayers. And so,
that was next on the list.
And so then it's kind of like, all right, let's suppose you go out and you get your land, and you've decided that about 7 acres is about right for you. And it's kind of like, how much buffer do you need on your property to try to buffer you from your neighbors? And I think that for a lot of people, they're going out and buying their own land and growing their own food because the stuff that you can get at Whole Foods, it says organic, but is it really? What is the story with that? And it's
legally.
And maybe even not.
Literally. True.
Organic according to Monsanto.
Organic according to Monsanto, and at the same time, did the grower take some shortcuts? I remember a story where a person was trying to do the right thing and visit with their farmers. Like, they wanted to know where their food came from and get an understanding of their values. And it's like, it sounded like the farmer had the right values. And so they visited, and it sounded like everything was just great. And then they heard the farmer talking to somebody else about, like, yellow jackets. And then it's like, oh, yeah, nothing works except for Raid, Just poison those motherfuckers. And so then it turned out that also when it came to ornamentals, they had no problem using Roundup. And so I kind of feel like so many people are all about organic, except, when they spray. So for the 362 days out of the year that they don't spray, they're organic. And then the few times that they do spray, well, what are you going to do? But hey, they're mostly organic.
Yeah.
And I've heard these same people say, oh, we're better than organic, but they spray. And it's kind of like, where the fuck do you think you're organic at all? And so I kind of have to wonder when you go and you get the food, and it's kind of like, well, when you buy the food at Whole Foods, it was grown in a monocrop. Mm-hmm. And that's contrary to my values. I wish to have food that's grown in a polyculture. Okay, so you're going to buy this land with the idea of growing something better. You want to know the story of your food. It's important.
Yes.
And then it's like, next thing you know, you're on this land and shit keeps happening, and you find that you're cutting corners a lot. And part of it is your neighbor sprays, and then it comes onto your land. Sometimes they have a little extra spray, so they just kind of shoot it out your way because there's a bunch of weeds on your land that they can see, and they can spray it a good 25 feet off of their wagon, and they're like thinking to themselves, "I'm helping this guy out because he's clearly got a lot of weeds over there. I can see him. I'm going to give him a little extra, do a little more for him, and that'll help make it so that there's a little less of his shitstorm coming on to my monocrop." And so they're helping you and helping themselves at the same time by spraying your land for free. No charge, buddy. Say, I'm helping you out. You owe me one now. And so, let alone the overspray, which is just like, they go to spray and a lot of it just comes. So now your stuff is tainted. And it's kind of like...
Not only spray, but you can also have, surface water runoff that is picking up those sprays and any other things that they're putting into the soil. So you have to also worry about what the water is bringing onto your land from your neighbors as well.
Well, yeah. Why is it that on the uphill side of my property, all I can grow is grass? Well, most of the herbicides are broadleaf herbicides. And so they kill everything except grass. And so it's like, okay, well, I had all these trees up there, but they're all dead now. And I tried growing legumes, but they all died. All that grows is grass. That's all. Why? And it's exactly what Mark is saying. And so, but even more than that, if it's a persistent herbicide, you go and you do chop and drop. You're going to I'm going to go cut all that grass, and now I'm going to go lay the grass as a mulch over on my garden over here, and then your garden dies. And it's kind of like, I bought this property, I moved my family, it's now a pain in the ass to get to work. I did all of this so I could just know the story of my food. And it turns out I am now poisoning everything more than if I just kept buying shit at Whole Foods. And I think that this kind of story is the story, a big part of the story about how that guy sold that same property 6 times. Is that people would come and they would try to grow all this stuff and it wouldn't grow, and they learned more than they ever wanted to learn about all this stuff, and then they just were like, fuck it, and they walked away from the property and they just went back to work in town. And so, all right, the question is how many acres? We're talking about how many acres, and it's like, okay, a person's looking for 7 acres, and what I'm trying to say is, you might need a sacrifice buffer around your property, and how big of a sacrifice buffer you might need might change from property to property.
And
so suddenly it's 20 acres.
If there's nobody spraying there now, who's to say what's going to happen in 5 years down the road?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. If you can have a buffer like a hedgerow of some sort, like you said, you still don't know in the future if somebody's going to show up and poison those plants with good intentions. But if you do have that hedgerow on a property you're looking at, then one, you know that there isn't those broadleaf herbicides in play already. And 2, if anything is sprayed on occasion, for dealing with whatever the neighbor's dealing with, that you do have that sort of a windbreak that will sort of limit how far onto your property that is going to travel.
This podcast is continued in part 2.
Don't forget, go out to patreon.com/Paul Wheaton and make a pledge for future artifacts.